This video is going to be all about skin texture painting. In my opinion, adding some texture to the skin is a great way to liven up your portraits. Since an airbrush atomizes and sprays pigment, paintings will naturally have a soft and somewhat blurry look. In order to create sharp lines and textures, we'll utilize a few tools to help us out. Shields, masks, and erasing techniques work wonders in breaking up this naturally soft look of airbrush paint. In traditional oil painting, blends and soft transitions are created by blending the paint with a variety of brushes. Like many techniques in art, blending oil paint dates back to its popularity in the Renaissance, where sfumato was adopted as one of the 4 canonical painting modes. Sfumato is derived from the Italian fumo, meaning smoke. Like smoke, sfumato paintings are soft without harsh contours defining the edges. Leonardo, a key practitioner of sfumato, defined the technique as painting without lines or borders in the manner of smoke. A prime example of this technique is of course used in the Mona Lisa, but in my opinion is most prominent in his painting of St. John the Baptist. This painting is so soft and overly blended that it almost has an airbrush-like appearance. We of course know that his works were painted with traditional brushes made of animal hairs, but the point that I'm trying to make is that when using an airbrush today, we have a natural sfumato tool in our hands. I understand the comparison is kind of a stretch, but without shields or masks, smooth blends and a smoke-like appearance is extremely easy to achieve with an airbrush. All you have to do is pull back on the trigger and spray the paint. So unlike traditional paint where we need tools to blend and soften the colors, airbrushing requires tools to sharpen forms and define the edges. Both types of paintings have their pros and cons, so it's important to choose the tool best suited for your style of painting. It's up to you to decide, but for me, I find myself moving further away from traditional oil painting day by day and choosing the airbrush as my primary painting tool. So let's get right into the painting. An important thing to think about anytime you're working on a portrait is the size of the painting. If you struggled with portraits in the past, it may be that your paintings were too small. If you make them slightly larger than life size, it becomes a lot easier because you have more room to work. I know that may sound counterintuitive, but I promise you paintings that are life size or smaller are way more difficult than larger paintings. So the size I'm working here is 22 inches, so just under 2 feet and about 1.5 feet wide. You could start wherever you like on a portrait, but I generally like to start with the eyes. Before we get into the skin texture techniques, I'm placing the photo reference up on the screen right now if you'd like to paint along with me. You could pause the video here and take a screenshot of this to transfer over to your canvas. You could transfer the contours over to your canvas any way you like, but the best way, if you're learning, is to set up a grid. I have a link down below in the video description to a video I made on a brief history of the artist grid and some techniques to use to set one up. When you're working on a portrait and you're thinking about adding something like skin texture, you have to think about 2 different values, the micro values and the macro values. The micro values are the highlights and shadows in any of the small detail parts of the portrait. There are thousands of these on any portrait and can get overwhelming very quickly. Things like pores, imperfections on the skin, freckles, acne. We could focus in on a few of these, but if we're painting things like pores, there's no way we could paint every single one. It would take years and years to complete. So to save some time, we're going to use a few techniques to make this process so much easier and give us the appearance of skin texture. A few months back, I made a tool that would help me out with these skin textures. So this is a piece of 7.5 mil Mylar. And what I did was I took a very cheap soldering iron, one that I got on Amazon for like $15, and I just put a bunch of holes in it in random areas and random sizes. It took about 10 or 15 minutes to make. In the future, I'll make some videos on different stencils and techniques you could use to make your own. But if you decide to make this, I just want to point something out, that the fumes from this are very dangerous. So if you decide to do this, make sure you do it outside and you wear something like a respirator so you don't breathe in any of the fumes. All the credit for this idea goes to Drew Blair. For months now, I've been using his small Mylar French curves. And before that, I've been using for years these cheap plastic French curves, which worked fine, but they weren't flexible like the Mylar. So they were difficult to use on airbrush paintings. But on Drew Blair's French curves, I noticed that he put all these little dots on the inside of the French curve, and I read on his website that these were for creating skin textures, and I tried it and I liked it, but it wasn't enough for me, and I wanted to create my own where I could adjust the texture as needed as I painted. But I decided to make my own, and I made this one specifically for this portrait that I was working on. So this was built to spray in the shadows of skin texture. It's not some magic tool where you just put it down and spray and you get automatic skin texture. So what this does is lay in hundreds of small shadows for the pores. And then once we have shadows in, we can come in with an electric eraser and quickly pull out highlights on each one of these shadows. Because remember, even something as small as a pore has a shadow and it has a highlight to it. So for the first eye, after I got the basic forms in, all I did was look at my reference the best I could and try to copy what I see. Now that template we made before, the small texture shield wasn't needed for this part of it. So I basically did this by hand like we talked about in the other video. Just sprayed in some areas to put my shadows in and then switched over to the eraser to pull them out. On the screen right now, I'm placing the formula I used to mix these skin tones. All these flesh tones are Createx illustration colors, and they're all fully transparent, meaning I didn't add any white to any of these. So when you spray them, they're going to be extremely dark. We adjust the value, the dark and light, by the amount we spray. In the future, I'll make a video that goes into a lot more detail on mixing flesh tones. All ethnicities are really the exact same flesh tone. It's all kind of a dark orange brownish color. The difference is the values, how dark they are, how light they are. So using these two transparent flesh tones, we're going to paint 90% of the portrait. But we're also going to be using some pure sepia, some pure burnt umber, and some pure black for other parts of the portrait. Underneath this eye, I'm going to start adding in some of this skin texture using the template that I made. I'm using the lighter value here because when you're spraying with an airbrush, you always want to spray as light as possible. You could always build it up darker as you move on. So what I'm doing with this tool is I'm holding it about a 1/4 inch away from the surface and spraying right over it very lightly. Now when I spray here, I constantly move back to see where I sprayed, to see what texture is down. And from there, I could decide if I want to add some more, or if I want to go darker. Since this color is fully transparent, the more I spray, the darker it's going to get. So you could see on the template right now how I'm spraying in one spot and it's getting darker and darker. That's the way we always adjust values with transparent colors. In my experience, it's more forgiving if you add the textures or wrinkles or creases of the skin before you add in the full values. That's what I talked about before by the micro values. When you're doing the micro values, you're doing what I'm doing here. You're adding in small shadows for things like skin pores or shadows underneath creases or wrinkles in the skin. And then once you have those in, you could adjust them. You could add highlights, you could lighten them, darken them. And then after that, if you want to adjust the value of the whole section, you could spray right over it with your transparent color and you won't lose any of that texture that you added in. And if I don't like these textures, there's no paint underneath them, so I could erase them right out by using some 4012 reducer and a paper towel and just wipe the area off clean and start again. Like I said, it's just a nice forgiving way to paint. I'm going to slow down the video here and zoom in so you can see what this texture looks like. On the first pass, we can see that this breaks up the uniform look of the white gessoed canvas. Remember that these are the shadows of pores, so we're going to have to come in later and add some highlights to it to start making it look like more realistic skin texture, because right now it kind of has a sandpaper look. But it's a good start to break up that natural soft airbrush look that we always get when just spraying without using any sort of shields or masks. And the goal of this is to help break up that sfumato smoky look that we naturally get from the airbrush. So after that texture's in, I could switch over to my airbrush and start laying down a very light coat of the exact same value toward the top part of it. This way I have a darker value that I can erase into. I'm using the Mars Razor eraser here and just pulling out a few highlights to add some texture. If we look above the eye in the reference photo, you'll notice that there's some creases just above the top eyelid. So a great little trick to add these in, instead of just using a French curve or a shield, is to take a piece of paper and rip it. This way you get an edge that's kind of organic and has some curves and kind of some randomness to it. So it's a great way to add in some shapes before you come in and add in the values. So once this is done, now I always switch back to the eraser and I can clean it up. Since this part of the canvas is basically blank, just the lines I painted in, if there's any mistakes, I could just erase this whole part out and start again. So it's a nice, easy, forgiving way to paint. So I'm switching over to the skin texture template and spraying in some of these dots just to the left part of the creases we added before, because I noticed in the reference photo that this area is a little bit darker, so I'm going to have to shade it. So I always want to get that texture in before I start putting the shading. You could see as I sprayed over it, the texture still stays, it doesn't disappear. So since we were able to get down all these micro shadows with that texture stencil, we could switch over now to the electric eraser and start adding in some highlights. If you look at the pupil of the eye, you'll notice that it's reflecting two light sources. This is called the specular highlight, and we can see from this that the right highlight is slightly brighter than the left one. So what I want to do is I want to add all these small micro highlights on the pores just to the right of each one of those shadows we placed in. Now you don't have to go crazy and try to get all these dots in perfectly. All you want to do is when you see a darker dot, just add a highlight to the right of it. When you use an electric eraser or a Dremel like I'm doing now, the highlights are going to pull out pure white right down to the surface, which is gessoed canvas. But that's not a big deal, because the beautiful thing about the airbrush, if anything's too light, we could just spray right back over it with our transparent flesh tone and knock the values back down. One thing I want to point out here is if you're looking at my painting and you're looking at the reference and notice that my eye looks slightly distorted, that's because I have to film it at a strange angle. I put the camera over to the left so you can get a clear shot while I'm painting. So just be aware of that as we're working on this. So before we use that ripped piece of paper to add in some of those shadows, which were the creases just above the eyelid. Just like the pores, those creases are going to need highlights too. I cut a chiseled edge at the edge of this eraser using a knife. This way it allows me to get really sharp details. Now above every single one of these shadows, I'm going to add in a highlight. And what I love about an eraser like this is I could decide how much paint I'm going to pull out by how much pressure I use. If I really press down on it, I'm going to remove the paint almost right down to the surface. But if I use less pressure, I can remove less paint so the highlight isn't as bright. This is such a great way to control values and is very similar to what you do in drawing. You do this all the time when you're using graphite pencils and normal graphite erasers. I'm also going to use an old airbrush needle to pull out some of the sharper, brighter highlights. Now, if you're watching this and you want more information on these erasers, I made a video last week that goes into detail about all different types of erasing techniques for airbrush painting. So I'll also have a link for that down below in the video description. Now that we have the highlights pulled out, I can see that they're way too bright. So I'm going to use this texture shield just to spray some of the skin texture over the top of it. And I'm doing this extremely lightly just to kind of break up any of the uniform look from that eraser. And then once that's done, I'm going to spray over the whole thing with the transparent color to knock the values down. Just like before, since we have some of that texture added in toward the bridge of the nose here, I'm going to switch over to my electric eraser and start pulling out some highlights. So when I sprayed over this texture, I can see that the airbrush just gave me way too soft of a look here. The value's about right. We want this to be pretty dark, but the texture's too smooth for this one. So I'm using this to pull out a bunch of little highlights, and I'm trying to do what I did before. I'm looking at each one of those dots that were put in from the skin texture template, and then just to the right of each one, I'm placing a highlight. Then I switched over to my darker skin mixture and sprayed it lightly over the top to kind of calm down any of those really bright highlights that the electric eraser pulls out. From here, I'm going to use the same color to start adding in some of the light shadows where the eyebrows are. I'm basically spraying in very soft hairs kind of in the background. If you watched any of my other airbrush videos, you'll know that I love using colored pencils for hair. So I'm going to do the same thing on this for the eyebrows. I'm going to use a black Prismacolor and start drawing these in. It's always good to have a variety of textures for hair. So I'm starting with my airbrush with pure black, and I'm adding in some of these hairs, which are going to be softer because I'm spraying them with the airbrush, and they're going to look like hair farther away. Then after that, when I switch over to the colored pencil, they're going to be much sharper and more defined. So we're going to kind of create some depth within the eyebrow. Some hairs closer to us and some farther away. Just a quick tip, if you're painting any type of hair or flyaway hair, try to move the airbrush very quickly back and forth. This will create a more natural look. I noticed a few hairs in the eyebrow are catching and reflecting the light, so I'm going to pull those out using an airbrush needle and an X-Acto blade. Since they pull out so bright, I'm just going to spray a light coat of dusting of black right over the top of it. Switching to the black Prismacolored pencil, I'm going to start adding in some of these sharper hairs, and I'm constantly looking back at my reference photo. That's going to tell me where I need to put these. So it's always important to study your reference and use that as your main learning tool. So once I'm finished with this section, like I am with this eye here, I'll generally walk away from it and then come back in an hour or so and look at it and decide what I want to adjust. So here I'm just going around cleaning up sections. I'm using the colored pencil to define some of the edges and darken up some areas. I'm also adding in some hairs for the eyelashes and some of the eyebrows. And I'm just constantly looking at my painting and looking at the reference and seeing what I could adjust and change. It's always a good idea to step away from your artwork and look at it with fresh eyes, maybe, in a few hours or even the next day. Now switching back to the Dremel tool, I'm going to add some of these highlights on the left side of this upper eyelid, just like I did before on the right side. Now let's continue adding some skin texture to the left of the eye. Another trick you could do is rotate the skin texture shield and kind of move it around while you spray through it. This is going to give you softer textures for the skin, and it's not going to be too sharp. Each one of these dots is going to be slightly softer, and it's a nice easier way to do it if you don't want them too harsh in the beginning. If you just hold it still and spray right through it, each of those little dots are going to be very sharp and defined, but if you kind of move it around and float it around, they'll be a little bit softer and kind of easier to work with because you can clean them up and erase them if you feel like you're unhappy with them. Now that those textures are in, I can spray the same transparent flesh tone right over the top of them. As you can see, I'm holding my airbrush pretty far away, about a foot back, and this way I can control it very lightly and spray right over the area to control the values. So when we're spraying over this, we're adjusting the macro values of the face. The micro values or shadows are already placed in using that shield. So here we could adjust the whole area by lightly spraying over it. And since we're spraying so light and using a transparent color, we're not going to lose those textures that we put down. As long as you go slow and you build the values up slowly, you'll be fine and those textures will stay there. And like we talked about earlier, any shadow needs a highlight next to it. So going around on these textures, I'm just using my Dremel tool to add highlights to the right of these. And I'm not trying to get them all perfect. I'm going very quick with this. Anytime I see a darker area, I'm just going to add a dot to the right of it. And when we erase, it's always going to pull out too bright. So you can see these highlights look very, very bright right now, but that's fine. We have some texture in, and then we'll spray back over it and lighten them back down. Something I like to do is switch between my erasers to get different textures for highlights, because if I stick with only one tool, like the Dremel tool, I'm going to have the same highlights around the whole painting, and it's going to look kind of odd, and it's going to look kind of sterile. So I'm switching between my different types of erasers and doing the same thing by adding in highlights to the right of the shadows, just using different tools. This way I'm going to get different textures and varying textures, and it's going to help with the realism of the actual final image. As human beings, we love order and we love predictable patterns. So when we're painting something like a portrait, we need to add randomness, and it's very hard for us to do this naturally. I know I struggle with this all the time. So one of the ways to try to get around that is to use something like a texture stencil that I made, or use different tools for erasing. This way it kind of breaks up that natural pattern look that we'll get if I try to do every single thing by hand. All the skin texture was painted with the first color, and it's just a little too light and slightly too warm. So I'm going to switch over to my cooler, darker color and spray it over the top of this to get the shadows looking more natural. Now to switch things up a little bit, I'm going to use this texture stencil to spray some texture on top of the paint that I already sprayed on the forehead. These are going to give slightly darker shadows, and it's going to help add some randomness to the image. Now looking at my reference, I can see that this part of the forehead has a highlight in it, so I'm going to pull out a lot of bright highlights here, and it's going to look like a bunch of little specular highlights. A specular highlight is any sort of highlight that's directly reflecting the light source, and this is going to give some contrast to this part of the image. Great thing again about airbrushing is if it's too bright and I don't like it, I could spray over it, knock it all back down. So I just put a little dusting of paint right over the top of it, but those highlights are still bright and it gives me a good texture. I'm going to use my French curve to add in some of the wrinkles on the forehead here. Now I'm spraying these on the right side of the forehead where I really don't have any paint, so I could switch over to an eraser after I have these in and clean them up if I need to. And of course, since these are shadows, they also need highlights, so I'm using the Stadler eraser to pull out highlights just above the shadows. On any portrait painting, you could play around with focus. So on the right side of the forehead here, I'm not going to add too much texture. So this is going to look like the image was taken with a photograph, and this section is slightly out of focus. So no texture, and just spray the paint over the top of it, and that's going to give a nice soft look. On this next eye, I'm not going to go into too much detail on how to paint it because this tutorial is really about painting textures, but I want to talk about the colors quickly. So the color I'm using here is the darker shade that we mixed, and this is going to help define the forms. Once I have those in and I feel comfortable with them, I'm going to switch over to Pure Black by Createx Illustration Colors to help darken these up and kind of set them in place where I want them. So for the first part of this video, we're going to be ending in here because this video is getting slightly too long. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a thing or two. In the next part, we're going to be working on the rest of the face, the nose, and the mouth, and I'll go into plenty of detail on how to paint those skin textures. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.